Right, let us come to the urgent question. David Simmonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Government if it will make a statement on community engagement principles and extremism.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. National security will always come first for this government, and we will always treat the threat of extremism with the seriousness it requires. And as the Prime Minister set out this morning, Britain now faces a new threat. A threat of extreme violence by individuals driven by material online, often now represented by single individuals who are driven by a twisted desire for notoriety. And this is a threat that we must contend with alongside that from traditional terrorist groups. And the House will be aware that the Home Secretary will be making a statement to this House shortly this afternoon. And all of this changing threat will be considered as part of the Home Secretary's rapid review, as ordered last year, which will inform this government's counter-extremism strategy. This review is considering the current understanding of extremism, including Islamist and far-right extremism, and will include focus on how best to tackle the threat posed by extremist ideologies online and offline. The early findings from this work were set out in December alongside initial measures to tackle the challenges we face. The Home Office will provide a further update on the measures and actions arising from the counter-extremism sprint shortly. With regards to MHCLG, our department, we retain responsibilities for communities and cohesion policy. The Deputy Prime Minister has convened a new cross-government communities recovery steering group to develop a comprehensive strategy to address the underlying causes of divisions in our local communities. In particular, this is seeking to address some of the causes that drove disorder across the UK following the Southport tragedy this summer. We have made clear that a new approach is urgently needed, and we've backed this with an initial £50 million of funding via the MHCLG Community Recovery Fund to support places impacted over the summer.
Shadow Minister Davidson.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. This question relates to the announcement by Michael Gove, who was then Secretary of State last March, when he set out some new definitions of extremism, including Islamist and far-right groups, and robust non-engagement principles for government, where there were serious concerns. It's particularly relevant in this MHCLG portfolio because for organisations such as social services, youth justice, Prevent, where public services are engaging at a community level with a variety of different organisations to gather intelligence, to support people to move away from extremism, and to intervene and disrupt, for example, emerging challenges such as grooming gangs. And it's also particularly important for our often vilified Muslim community, who contribute so much to our nation. The aim of those principles was to set out a new system for structured engagement. However, in July, the Chancellor announced £120 million of savings within the department from small projects. It subsequently emerged in written questions that an element of this is reduced funding for legal fees, which are no longer expected to arise from the previous government's cross-party approach to extremism. Since then, a series of questions have found it very challenging to determine exactly what this means. However, ministers have now told the House in answer to written questions that this statement reflects the fact that the government has chosen, in effect, to ditch the last government's policy on non-engagement and these principles. So the questions I'd like to put to the Minister, I'm very conscious this is very sensitive given the Southport statement, which we will be hearing later on about that specific case. But can he tell the House, does the Department still adhere to that working definition of Islamism? Does the Department still have a working definition of non-violent extremism that public bodies can rely on should they need to defend themselves if challenged? Can he tell the House why ministers have not been, to quote the Ministerial Code, as open as possible on this issue? And will he share with the House details of correspondence at any meetings that have taken place, and in particular the membership of the steering group that he referred to, so there is a high degree of transparency and confidence around this process?
Minister.
I'm grateful for the initial question and for that follow-up one. I don't think it would be a revelation to colleagues across the House that a change of government often means a change of approach to what have been shared views and shared problems in the past. You know, I believe that the previous government deeply wanted to tackle extremism in all its forms across the country. We share that. Where we differ is in the approach taken by the department. Previously, as was subject to the written ministerial statement last year, and this is, I have to say something that I simply cannot agree with. The previous Secretary of State, for whom I have a lot of respect, chose to assume a lot of responsibility, essentially, for the entire government within MHCLG. I think there's very good reasons why that isn't the right approach, because actually, counter-extremism, I believe, should be the fundamental purview of the Home Office, not least because of the access to often confidential information that they get that MHCLG doesn't. So the approach we've chosen as a new government is for a cross-government but Home Office-led counter-extremism sprint that's going to lead to a counter-extremism strategy in due course to shape the government's way forward. That is a different approach to what is, I believe, a commonly understood problem. I can't accept the Honourable Gentleman's characterisation that the previous process was particularly robust. Let's be honest, it was not used. You know, the Secretary of State set out, the previous Secretary of State set out a flourishing written ministerial statement with a system that could have led. He named some organisations, but was very clear. It was very clear in the written ministerial statement that that was not prejudging any process for those organisations, and subsequently did not use that process. So I would question attachment to a previous process that the previous government chose not to use. On the point of openness, I've answered multiple questions from the Secretary of State, from the Shadow Secretary of State and the Shadow Minister. I'll continue to do so. Obviously, we have the opportunity to do as well, so we will be as open as we possibly can be. And similarly, with regards to the steering group, I don't think we have made that public, but I'm sure there's no problem in doing so, and I'll make sure that that's available.
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think at a time when we are seeing such an increase in religious hate crime, including Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, we all have a duty in this House to be careful around the language we use. And I hope that the government will also look at the language coming out from the government, because it's really vital for community cohesion that we are careful and we don't unintendedly inflame this. There are some really critical issues going on, not just in this country, but around the world. But can the Minister outline that in looking at the definition and changing anything in place by the previous government, that the Minister will outline whether the government will consult on any new definition, which, if we're honest and we look back and, you know, following the Minister's response, the lack of consultation by the previous government.
Minister.
I'm grateful for that question from the Chair of the Select Committee. I think the point on language is an important one. I think it is reasonable and right that our constituents would expect us to be robust where those who choose to challenge and undermine democracy and those basic principles that guide our society, but also that we use our platform, our very privileged platform, not to give rise and not to give succour for hateful ideas and prejudices. And indeed, that's one of the things we know of the changing nature of terror, is that those individuals are taking cues from organisations themselves that are stopping short of an obvious threshold of inflaming terrorist-type behaviours, but that instead are using that as encouragement. I think we all have a responsibility, therefore, to be very measured in that. With regards to the engagement for the Home Office, we will want to make sure that anything that comes out of the cross-government sprint and then into the strategy is one that communities across the country can buy into, can have ownership from. So, of course, there will be engagement in that regard.
The Real Democrat spokesperson, Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we know, the world is a fast-moving, scary place, and we know that people who feel disempowered and isolated are often turning to the internet. They're often very vulnerable people, and their reliance on the internet for everything in their world puts them at even greater risk. So we must work with our community leaders to make the most of the information they hold and get early notice of the problems. What worries me is the risk of authoritarian decision-making that affects all of us if we make these assumptions we don't actually work with our community. So what consultation with communities has been taken around these changes, and what additional burdens might fall on local authorities in terms of changes to how the government works? And furthermore, with such extreme things taking place online, especially with our social media giants across the pond, what's the government doing actively to unite faith and cultural leaders, environmental groups with industries and across generations to foster unity and stop extremism across the whole spectrum?
I'm grateful for that question. I mean, I share a lot with what the Honourable Lady says in terms of earlier interventions and tackling isolation at its root. I think, as she says, local authorities are really important partners in that. That's why we'll ensure that whatever comes out of our Communities and Recovery Steering Group leans into that partnership of local authority, of course local law enforcement where possible, to make sure that those right resources and support are in place. And she asks about engagement, and she asks about making sure we have a contribution from those who would be affected in terms of across our faith communities. My honourable friend from the other place, the Noble Lord Khan, the Faith Minister, has met with representatives of all faiths, and it will continue to do so, to keep having that exact dialogue. And it's important between the government and different faith groups, so that we are making sure that the ideas that we bring forward are going to be effective and are rooted in real life, but also as a real promotion of interfaith work, as she talks about. Because actually I know from my own community that when we've had challenges, the best thing we've had to lean on is that interfaith relationship across faith to tackle hate wherever it might emerge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is real division in our communities, and extremism is changing at great speed. And I know that the vast majority of members in this House treat such division as a tragedy and something that needs to be solved calmly. However, there are some, sadly, who appear to view it as a political opportunity. Does he agree with me that members in this place need to be calm in their dialogue on this issue, and where they are not, should be called out by all political parties?
Minister.
Well, I've always felt that there's two types of politicians. There's ones who seek to move things forward politically by bringing people together, and those who seek to exploit division. And, you know, it's up to individual members, honourable members, to decide which of which is their personal approach. When it happens in political parties and where there is divisive or bordering on hateful language, we would expect them to resolve that in their normal ways. But we are, certainly with regards to leadership of this country, we're the luckiest people in the country. We get to come here every day and to take these issues head on in the interests of our community, in the interests of our country. And I think almost exclusively the case, I see members use that platform for good. We may have very important distinctions and differences. That's great in a democracy, but we want to bring the country together, and we want to move the country forwards together. And I think that's certainly the approach that I will be using.
Sir Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister reassure the House in terms of the approach in terms of the Muslim Council for Britain? There is very real reasons as to why the last government decided to break off engagement with the MCB because of the infiltration that had happened in that organisation. And can the Minister say to the House that he and his government will not be engaging with it?
Well, I, like all my ministerial colleagues in department, and like all ministers from the Prime Minister and across the government, it is a matter of public record who we meet with, and that can be interrogated in its right way. I'm going to stop short of a running commentary organisation by organisation around who we won't meet, because, well, as I say, I'm not going to provide a running commentary on that organisation. We know the previous, as I say, it is very clear for the matter of record who I do and don't meet with.
Debbie Abrahams.
Mr. Speaker, I was a little bit concerned about the conflation of extremism by the Shadow Minister and child sexual exploitation and grooming gangs there. And does my my honourable friend agree with me that the importance of using our language, but not only that, but how we use our language is really important to avoid eradicating or the social cohesion that many of us have spent many years establishing in our communities.
Minister. I think it is important that we're careful in our language. I think it's important we're careful with conflations. And one thing I know about many years of building trust in my community is it takes a long time to build that trust, but it can be lost very quickly as well if we are thoughtless in the language that we use.
So Desmond Sway.
When a crime has the attributes of a terrorist outrage, but the police, in their engagement with the community, proactively announce that it's not initially being treated as such, isn't it bound to give rise to a public suspicion that the truth is being covered up?
Minister.
I mean, I don't know what particularly the honourable gentleman is referring to. But you didn't have to use coded language if it did mean a specific incident. But what I would say it is rightly there is a distinction between what the government of the day does and what the police do, and we're not there to direct the police. But I know that all public bodies, in line with what I've said, need to be careful about the language they do because it has real-world consequences.
Peter Swallow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members across the House will know how important community engagement is to building strong communities, and working together with those whose views we may not share but we can respect is really important. And I want to pay tribute to the fantastic work of the Bracknell Forest Interfaith Forum in doing exactly that in my community. The party opposite winning government cut funding to the interfaith network, working at a national level. So I want to ask the Minister, what can we do to support organisations like the Bracknell Forest Interfaith Forum to bring religious groups together and understand that we do indeed have more in common than that which divides us?
Yes, I think there was a real sadness that the previous government moved away from interfaith as a model. My honourable friend, the Faith Minister, has been very clear of how important he thinks it is, and that's why promoting interfaith work has been a real core part of the work that he's done so far.
Kirsty Black.
Mr. Speaker, we know that a number of the individuals who are radicalised find that radicalisation and are encouraged to do so by platforms on the dark web, high-risk platforms. Will the Minister and the Home Secretary ensure that they work together with the Department for Culture, Media and Sport to ensure that the Online Safety Act does as it was intended to do, which is to regulate those high-risk platforms, rather than the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport just allowing Ofcom to step away from that and let them do what they like?
Well, I would share the intent with the Honourable Lady. We know that whether it's in publicly available online forums or whether it's in the dark web, there are people who will use all corners of the internet in order to promote their views and to promote hateful ideologies as part of our counter-extremism sprint and the strategy that will follow from that. We're looking very carefully about this and the tools that we need to use in order to tackle it.
Colin Dace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will all be sadly familiar with the shocking and racist remarks made by Conservative Party donor Frank Hester last year. Now, I do not intend to repeat them in this House so that we don't have to relive them. But does the Minister agree with me that this kind of language encourages extremism and has no place in our politics?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have to be careful, both as individuals and collectively within our parties, about the individuals with which we choose to associate, with whom perhaps we choose to take money from, in order to make sure that we're not sending messages that I don't think would be the messages we want to send.
Mark Blitchard.
Review, perhaps he can give the House a timetable. And part of that review, could he include the Charity Commission and ask what charities might be dividing our communities rather than unifying our communities? And finally, could there be more members of the cabinet, officials from the Cabinet Office and Home Office seconded to his department in order that decisions around Prevent and this review are taken in a better way?
Well, with regards to the strategy and its development particularly, I don't want to preempt the Home Secretary because I'm conscious that she's making the next statement. With regards to the point on Cabinet Office resourcing and secondments, I think the House would expect, and we would make the commitment that fundamentally we are one government, and we have to find those internal ways to work effectively. But come what may, we will not hide behind those as excuses for why things aren't effective. Instead, when ministers like myself ask questions, we'll address them in the spirit of one government.
Let's look at
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend both sides of the House on this statement in the way in which they've respectfully approached this, because that's really, really important. The Minister did talk about the robustness of this topic, and I'm really keen to pick him up on that, because on one tenet in the UK is all about safety. The other is freedom of speech. So can the government rule out changing any definitions that could lead either intentionally or unintentionally towards blaspheme laws, because free speech is really important?
I mean, again, the Home Secretary will have the chance to talk about the counter-extreme strategy in due course, but to give assurance to the honourable gentleman, we've been looking at what the early signs from that review have been, as have been talked about in December by my honourable friend, the Security Minister, were around the places in which hate fester, rather than legislative changes to some degree.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
Today, of course, are with the families of those 3 poor little girls and everybody hurt in the terrible event last summer. And it is inexcusable that state agencies missed vital opportunities to intervene in this devastating case, including, of course, 3 crucial points following prevent referrals. These failings shine a grim light on the significant cracks in our public services following years of spending cuts and underinvestment. Will he join me in calling for the public inquiry to consider the role of austerity since 2010 as a contributing factor to these terrible failings?
Again, I'm afraid I can't preempt what the Home Secretary is about to say, and the Honourable Lady will have the chance to put that point to her. I will say that in our community strategy and our attempts to ensure that communities are resilient ones where people can live together in harmony, we are considering, of course, what was said in the Dame Sarah Khan review, of which one of the underlying causes that she raises concerns with was austerity. We need to make sure we've got well-resourced public services. We need to make sure that people don't feel that there is a division and an allocation of resources that in some way is targeted against them. We know that that should never be the case and would never be the case. So, of course, we're considering that as part of our community's work.
Katie Love.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The independent review of Prevent, the government programme that tries to stop people being radicalised by extremist views, said on its very first page, and I quote, "The facts clearly demonstrate that the most lethal threat in the last 20 years has come from Islamism, and this threat continues. The last government knew this to be true. Does this one?"
Minister.
Well, this government has taken on the independent review of Prevent. I know that 33 out of 34 of those recommendations have been implemented. We are engaged in the counter-extremism sprint that we are. Counter-extremism strategy will flow from that, and the Honourable Lady will have a chance to see that.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to have a go at getting an answer from the Minister, even if he doesn't answer the questions from my right honourable friends from the world of Kent and from Stone, Great Worley and Penkridge. Yesterday, his department confirmed in an FOI answer that there is internal government correspondence about the Muslim Council of Britain that it refuses to publish. Can the Minister overturn that decision, publish the papers and confirm that there have been no discussions and no correspondence within Whitehall proposing re-engagement with the MCB?
I can assure the honourable gentleman that the position has not moved. I've stated in written questions previously that we aren't meeting with Muslim. But again, I'm not sure I can say it any more clearly than in the dispatch box of the Chamber of the House of Commons. The position's not changed from the previous government.
Jim Shine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Minister very much for his answers to all of the questions? In Northern Ireland, of course, we've faced extremism from left and right. At the same time, we've managed to have community engagement as part of that, and I believe lessons can be learnt. It is essential that our police forces have the wherewithal to deal with threats in an appropriate mechanism. Therefore, the designation of community and extremism threats is truly essential. So will the Minister outline if the process of designation can be streamlined to ensure the police have all the powers that they need to work within communities to root out and deal with paramilitaries and extremists with the safeguards for human rights? Thank you.
I am grateful for the honourable gentleman's question. I know that his particular work around the persecution of Christians across the world actually reads across to some of the challenges that he talks about in terms of making sure that we have cohesive communities across the UK. Of course, policing is a devolved matter, so perhaps it's slightly different for a minister in the UK Parliament today. But what I will assure him is that we do give the best insight to public institutions to make sure they are interacting in the best way possible. I do often feel for, say, junior officers early on in their service having to deal with what are often quite complicated issues in live time. So we want to make sure they get the best information so they are able to do so.
That completes the UQ.